The hiss of the pressure seal on cargo module 7 Beta always smelled of old ozone and synthetic oil, a cheap ship trying to pretend it still had dignity. Warrant mechanic Jory Silko wiped the residual moisture from the interface, his hands moving with the practiced, almost surgical slowness of a man who believed the devil lived in unchecked decimal points. It was the third time he had verified the ballast locks on the empty hold, a bureaucratic redundancy that everyone aboard the Argus, a ship defined by low priority and even lower budget, found hilarious. "Silko, are you kissing that panel, or are we going to see the all clear before the heat death of the universe?" Captain Neris's voice crackled from the bridge feed, heavily laced with static and amusement. Jory didn't look up. His parchment-thin skin, worn tired by years of low-level deep space radiation, barely reacted to the slight increase in heart rate. "Verification of 0G load balance compliance, Captain. Procedure 6.4, subsection B, redundancy protocol mandated for proximity to high-volume gravity wells." A wave of strained laughter followed from the bridge crew, the brittle sound amplified by the comms. Neris usually enjoyed baiting Jory. His pedantry was a reliable source of entertainment in the endless void. Jory merely tightened the final inspection bolt, a habit born from that day years ago, when he hadn't checked the primary cooling jacket on the Pioneer, a mistake that cost two good engineers their thermal regulation and ultimately their lives. That failure had forged the man who now checked an empty module 3 times. He secured the locking mechanism. Complete. The laughter from the bridge did not fade. It didn't distort. It simply stopped. Cut clean, as if a master switch governing all acoustic phenomena in the entire sector had been thrown to the off position. The Argus shuddered. A negligible vibration that felt more like a cough than a shockwave. Jory braced instinctively against the bulkhead, his focus snapping instantly from the mundane mechanical task to the impossible silence. The fleet, kilometers away, was positioned for the transit window through the Tychon remnant, a colossal, turbulent singularity barely contained by its own rotation, a gravity well so dense it distorted local space-time visibly. On Jory's exterior monitor feed, the distant running lights of the Armada. Hundreds of ships, their hulls polished against the black, were no longer sharp white points. They were smears. They were bleeding. The light that reached the Argus from the bulk of the fleet was being redshifted, pulled toward the deep, painful red end of the spectrum. It was the visual signature of immense, catastrophic gravity. The ships, caught in the sudden gravitational shear, were accelerating away from Jory at incredible rates, their light visibly struggling to reach his viewport. But the light wasn't just red-shifted, it was slow. The massive destroyer, Acheron, positioned near the Nexus, had already begun its micro-burn maneuvers seconds ago. Jory now watched the exhaust flame plume expand with terrifying, impossible leisure, like ink spreading through molasses. A few degrees of arc movement that should have taken milliseconds stretched into a measurable second on his local chronometer. Jory stared at his display. The fleet chronometer, linked to the main Armada's timing systems, was entirely blank. But the local clock on the Argus, the isolated low-precision timer running off the ship's own core resonator, was still ticking. It showed the current date and time, 27th of October, 2383:09, 12 local. Then the Argus's main comms panel, dead silent only moments before, erupted in a chorus of frantic, distorted emergency pings. Jory pulled the comms history overlay, ignoring the deafening digital clamor of the present crisis. He scanned the message headers, his eyes moving past the immediate influx of raw data. His breath hitched, cold and sharp, turning the ozone taste in his mouth metallic and raw. Every single one of the distress pings carried a timestamp, not the current date, but a date 4 years and 9 months prior. 27th of January, 2379. The catastrophic gravitational spike near the Tychon nexus had fundamentally decoupled their timelines. Jory's momentary proximity to the anchor point, the precise coordinates where the Argus was stationary for its unnecessary load-balancing check, had caused a relativistic slip. While the rest of the fleet had accelerated into the gravity wells gradient and begun maneuvering for the transit window, a window that now clearly slammed shut on them, Jory's stationary position near the temporal fulcrum had launched his local timeline forward. His clock had advanced by 8 standard years relative to the rest of the Armada. He was receiving frantic, immediate distress signals from the fleet, 4 years too late. The voice of Captain Neris finally came through, a desperate, panicked whisper of static and corrupted data, pleading for damage reports and cooling jacket integrity. It was the very moment the captain realized the severity of the spike. That moment, still living and terrifying for Neris, was history for Jory. He was an audience to a tragedy that was still unfolding, yet already lost. The Argus, always the last in line, the cheapest, the one tethered to the bureaucratic necessity of holding its position for the required check, was now a temporal refugee. His pedantry, the very thing that earned the scorn of the bridge crew, had been his salvation, isolating him just enough at the point of sheer to save his life. The irony tasted like ash. Jory pushed off the bulkhead floating across the maintenance bay. The cheap synth carpet beneath his boots felt spongy, unreal. The silence in the ship was profound, a vacuum created by the sudden departure of all other living temporal consciousness. His first rational thought was not about rescue or the destruction of the fleet visible in slow-motion agony outside the port. It was the manifest. 1,512 colonists, sleeping in cryostasis deep in the ship's belly, paying for a future Jory was now obligated to deliver. The colonists were the reason the Argus was here, the low-priority transport carrying precious cargo to the unproven habitable rock, 80 light-years away, known only by its designation, Cygnus Prime. To break stasis now would be murder. The resource drain and psychological trauma of waking them up alone, without supplies or fleet support, was unviable. Jory reached the primary interface console and slapped the emergency override, silencing the barrage of 4-year-old distress calls. He couldn't afford to listen to the ghosts scream. He called up the Argus's internal sensor report. Power nominal. Drive core stable. Life support nominal. Everything was fine, mechanically perfect, running precisely according to the protocol he had obsessively maintained. And that was the horror. The Argus was perfectly equipped for its original mission, a low-grade, supported standard transit across 40 light-years of mapped space, cushioned by the presence and assistance of the massive Armada. Now, Jory was alone. 80 light-years of uncharted, hostile void stretched between him and the colony. He was the sole steward of a civilization that didn't know it needed saving, piloting a ship designed for bureaucracy, not independent survival. He looked at the external viewport again. The Acheron, still stretching its microburn exhaust plume in that agonizingly slow loop, was beginning to experience catastrophic structural failure, visible only as infinitesimal buckling of the hull plating. Jory knew that in the Acheron's time frame, the hull was tearing open in an instant. For him, the moment of rupture would take hours to fully manifest. The temporal wall was not just a phenomenon, it was a physical barrier. He was watching history unfold, powerless to intervene, unable to send a signal back into their living past, and unable to interact with their immediate present. He was severed from the very civilization he was meant to be serving. He checked the power consumption readout, his mind already recalculating trajectories, fuel reserves, and cryo-maintenance cycle optimization using the old, analog redundancy systems he always insisted on keeping operational. 43 days of primary life support at current crew consumption. Jory was alone, He was the crew. The ship was silent, except for the whisper of recycled air and the low, comforting hum of the cryobase systems below. He had to get to Cygnus Prime, alone, with the ghosts of the fleet screaming behind him. He activated the Argus's primary navigation console, ignoring the persistent phantom echoes of the captain's voice still residing in the buffer. The screen lit up with the full fleet trajectory map. The Argus was still mathematically tethered to the jump window coordinates. It was the anchor. If he broke that position now, the relativistic separation might destabilize the nascent gate alignment, risking the entire sector. He was required to hold anchor until the fleet had passed. But the fleet was not passing. The fleet was dissolving in extreme slow motion 4 years in the past. Jory felt the familiar internal burn of a decision that had no correct answer. His duty was to the mission, delivery of the 500 colonists. His duty was also to protocol, holding the anchor position. The pedant in him screamed, "Hold the anchor, wait for the window." The man who had failed to check a cooling jacket years ago whispered, "You are already 4 years too late, you must move." He reached out to input the revised trajectory, bypassing the defunct fleet coordination AI. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, thick and slightly trembling from the residual low-level radiation that had aged his skin prematurely. He was the ghost left behind. He had to accept his new status, a survivor severed from time, navigating the void in solitude. The clock was ticking, but the time it measured was his alone. Every second he spent honoring the memory of the fleet was a second stolen from the future of the sleeping colonists. He needed resources. He needed fuel. And there were several supply tenders among the dying fleet, still burning their last micro-maneuvers in the endless temporal loop. Dying ships, still alive in their own time frame, filled with fuel and materials Jory desperately needed. He could not communicate with them. He could not warn them. He could only steal from their dying moments. Jory felt a sharp, cutting realization. To survive, he had to become a scavenger. He had to exploit the temporal gap, using the very physics that saved him to loot the graves of his comrades. He punched in the coordinates for the closest vessel, a low-profile fuel skiff named the Aurelia, which was currently visible only as a faint, stretched ellipse of red light. He would need a close proximity burn maneuver, dangerous even in normal space, impossible in this gravitational shear. He accessed the Argus drive controls. His hands moved quickly, compensating for the 4 years of historical data that flooded the comms panel, ignoring the silent accusation of the captain's ghost. Then a warning light flashed across the console, red and absolute. It was a lock on the cryobay maintenance override. The system, designed to protect the colonists from sudden decisions by stressed crew, required a 2-person simultaneous verification to authorize an emergency jump maneuver outside the established fleet trajectory. Jory was alone. He was the sole steward of the colony, but the system itself was designed to prevent a single steward from taking unilateral life-or-death risks. He slammed his fist onto the metal casing of the console, the sound dull and flat in the unnatural silence of the ship. The system was locked. He couldn't move the ship without bypassing the safety mechanism, and the bypass would take 40 minutes, time he could not spare. He leaned his forehead against the cold metal, his breath heavy. The decision was no longer merely philosophical. It was now brutally, physically concrete. He had to decide what was more important. The protocol meant to protect the 512 sleeping lives, or the necessity of acting immediately to ensure their delivery. The very thoroughness that saved him was now the chain that bound him. He pulled up the schematic for the cryobay lock. He knew the circuitry. He could cut it physically, but that would leave a log that would scream sabotage. A log that would condemn him if he ever reached Cygnus Prime. He stared at the screen, and the face of Captain Neris warped and terrified in the frozen frame of 4 years ago, seemed to stare back, accusing him of his inevitable breach of protocol. Jory took a slow, deep breath, tasting the ozone and the bitter synth coffee on his tongue. The coffee tasted 4 years old. He reached for the wiring schematics for the life support buffer, bypassing the main drive lock entirely, finding a low-level diagnostic port known only to warrant mechanics with too much time and too much paranoia. If he couldn't break the rules directly, he would make the rules irrelevant. He was not going to break stasis. He was not going to murder them. But he was going to deliver them, even if it meant becoming the criminal who stole their ship and their future. He initiated the low-level diagnostic sequence. His hands, tired and precise, moved to the power conduits, bypassing the main lock sequence. The process would take time, but the system would register it as routine maintenance, not a system breach. As his fingers danced across the secondary coupling, a new audio message blinked on the console, Priority 1. It was raw data, untagged, highly compressed, and originating not from the distant, dying fleet, but from somewhere close. The message wasn't a distress call. It was a short, sharp burst of highly complex code. A warning beacon utilizing a quantum entanglement key Jory recognized immediately. It was a classified cipher known only to military surveyors and highly specialized extraction teams. It signaled immediate, overwhelming danger. Jory paused, his fingers frozen above the power couplings. He was not alone in the void. Someone, or something, had sent a message from his current temporal reference frame, and that something was closer than the Tychon remnant. The beacon's message was a simple loop, repeating every 10 seconds, echoing the sterile emptiness of the void. Do not follow the timeline. Divergence is mandatory. Jory looked out at the bleeding lights of the fleet, still dying in slow motion, 4 years behind him. He looked at the message, immediate and terrifyingly real. His choice was no longer about honor and protocol versus survival. It was about which version of reality he could trust, the ghost of his past or the imminent unknown terror of his present. He finished the wiring bypass and the drive lock flickered green. The Argus was free to move. He looked down at the console. The quantum beacon repeated its warning. Jory realized the immediate, horrifying consequence. This warning was only possible if the entity sending the signal also existed outside the standard temporal constraints, if they were also somehow refugees of the spike. He was not just alone. He had company in the relativistic silence, and that company was running. Jory Silco initiated the manual microburn. The Argus shifted, a small, stubborn movement against the cosmic terror. He ignored the flashing warning, knowing he was gambling everything on a ghost, but not the ghosts of the past. He was gambling on the ghost of the present. And the quantum beacon repeated, its message a hammer blow in the dark. Divergence is mandatory. O silêncio que se seguiu não era como os anteriores. Não era o vazio da ausência, mas a quietude forçada da contenção. Jory Silco estava flutuando na escuridão entre a lógica e o pânico. Sua mão, que acabara de religar o sistema de propulsão sob a camuflagem de uma rotina de manutenção, ainda pairava sobre o painel. O drive lock estava verde, o Argus estava livre, mas a liberdade tinha um custo imediatamente visível. O rastreador de navegação mostrava que o microburn que acabara de executar, um movimento insignificante para um cargueiro daquele porte, havia rasgado a coordenada temporal de amarração que ele supostamente deveria manter. Um alarme fantasma, programado para soar se o Argus violasse o protocolo da frota, não pôde alcançá-lo. O tempo estava partido. Ele só sentiu o cheiro do erro. O ar na cabine pareceu ficar subitamente mais rarefeito, mais frio, como se a própria ética do navio tivesse exalado o oxigênio em protesto. Jory ignorou o frio. Olhou para o beacon repetindo o loop de aviso: divergência é obrigatória. A fonte do sinal não estava mais ali, o que significava que o transmissor era rápido ou estava a uma distância considerável. A prioridade era a Aurélia, o esquife de combustível preso no tempo a alguns quilômetros. 4 anos atrás, a Aurélia teria enviado um drone de reabastecimento. Agora, Jory teria que manobrar o Argus, um caminhão lento e desajeitado no vácuo, até a lateral de uma agulha espacial que estava na prática, congelada a uma taxa de 1 milissegundo por hora. Ele assumiu o controle manual do propulsor. O movimento exigiria a precisão de um mergulhador. Se ele errasse por 1 grau, o Argus colidiria com uma nave fantasma que, em sua própria linha temporal, estava apenas a meio caminho de sua morte. A inércia do Argus faria o navio-tanque se desintegrar e Jory perderia o combustível de que precisava desesperadamente. Ele empurrou o joystick, sentindo o torque pesado nos suportes de montagem do assento. O silêncio do navio era quebrado apenas pelo sussurro elétrico das baterias. Ele precisava de música, música alta, qualquer coisa para preencher a ausência ensurdecedora de vozes humanas. Ele ligou o sistema de entretenimento secundário, acessando o arquivo de áudio pessoal do Capitão Neres. Tocar a música do capitão que estava morrendo em câmera lenta fora de sua janela era um ato de luto ou de rebeldia. Jory não sabia qual. Uma melodia antiga de rock espacial, distorcida e melancólica, preencheu a cabine. O Argus se moveu. Lento. Terrível. Jory compensou a distorção gravitacional extrema com pequenos pulsos de propulsão. Concentração total. Ele sentia o peso de 1.512 vidas dormindo abaixo dele, confiando no pedantismo que o havia salvo e na capacidade de violar protocolos que o havia libertado. Ele se lembrou daquele dia no Pioneer, o cheiro de metal fundido. Não foi a falha do Pioneer que o assombrava, mas a falha de Jory. Ele havia sido distraído por uma discussão trivial com um colega de trabalho sobre a otimização do filtro de ar. 5 minutos de conversa fiada. 5 minutos que custaram a vida do engenheiro-chefe Hela e de seu assistente. Ele não checou o Primary Cooling Jacket. A pedantaria de Jory não era vaidade. Era uma penitência eterna. Ele não se permitia negligência porque, sob a superfície de seu dever, ele sabia que era fundamentalmente falível, e ele estava a 80 anos-luz de distância de qualquer ajuda. A falha agora significaria o assassinato em massa dos colonos. O esquife Aurélia cresceu na janela, ainda um borrão vermelho esmagado pela distorção. Jory podia ver a escotilha de ancoragem, aberta em seu próprio tempo, como se estivesse esperando por ele. Ele estava a apenas 50 metros, flutuando paralelamente ao esquife. Ele podia sentir o campo gravitacional do Tychon Remnant puxando ambos os navios, a atração aumentando a cada segundo que passava. Engate magnético. Ele sussurrou para o sistema automatizado, que felizmente funcionava em sua linha temporal. Engate magnético ativado. Respondeu a IA feminina, sua voz calma e irritantemente normal. Um baque suave. O Argus estava acoplado. Jory podia agora bombear o combustível da Aurélia para seus tanques. O roubo estava feito, mas o beacon quântico piscou novamente, seu loop de aviso acelerando para cada 5 segundos. Divergência é obrigatória. Tempo de acesso iminente. Jory franziu a testa. Iminente. O que isso significava em um sistema de tempo deslocado? Ele chamou a leitura do scanner da fonte. O sinal, embora não fosse um rastreador direto, era um vetor de aproximação. A fonte estava chegando. Rápido. Jory olhou para o monitor externo. Onde antes havia apenas o preto profundo do vácuo, agora havia uma distorção. Não o redshift lento do campo gravitacional, mas um branco, espectral e violento, quase como uma lágrima no tecido do espaço. Era luz azul, intensa e compacta, A assinatura de algo se movendo a uma velocidade extrema, quase atingindo a velocidade da luz em sua própria referência temporal. Antagonista introduzido. O objeto era minúsculo, quase invisível. Uma agulha negra contra o rasgo branco. Estava convergindo para o ponto exato onde a Argus e a Aurélia estavam estacionadas. Jory cortou a transferência de combustível pela metade. Ele precisava de pelo menos 70% dos tanques da Aurélia para fazer o salto de 80 anos-luz. Ele estava apenas em 30%. 40 minutos. Preciso de 40 minutos, Jory murmurou, puxando os dados de velocidade do objeto. O objeto estava viajando rápido demais. Sua aproximação sugeria que ele estava usando a distorção gravitacional do Tychon Remnant para se mover de maneira quase instantânea em relação à velocidade da luz padrão. Era a tática de um predador que usava o ambiente como arma. Ele era um escavador, aproveitando o momento da destruição da frota para caçar o que restava. Mas o que restava? Jory, o Argus, ou os 1.500 colonos. A agulha negra agora era visível como um contorno. Jory a reconheceu. Era um navio de reconhecimento de longo alcance, um modelo militar antiquado, otimizado para velocidade e furtividade, com um revestimento de radiação que o tornava quase invisível para scanners passivos. O navio não estava vindo para resgate. Estava vindo para extração ou eliminação. O loop do beacon quântico mudou. Não era mais uma mensagem. Era um ping ativo, uma transmissão direta, mas codificada. Jory conseguiu decifrar a camada mais externa do código de guerra, um alerta antiquado da Marinha de reconhecimento. Alvo, Argus. Carga, 1.512 unidades. Prioridade, captura viva. Protocolo de engajamento. Não há sobreviventes na área de exclusão. Eliminar anomalias. A Marinha. Mas não a Marinha de Jory. A Marinha de 4 anos no futuro. Jory compreendeu a dimensão da armadilha. A anomalia temporal que o havia salvado não era um erro da natureza. Era um acidente catastrófico que havia criado um fantasma. Um navio fora de fase no espaço de tempo padrão. E fantasmas eram inconvenientes. Sua existência colocava em risco a integridade temporal de toda a região. O problema era maior do que a simples sobrevivência. A civilização que ele tentava servir estava ativamente caçando-o, considerando-o uma aberração biológica e temporal que precisava ser neutralizada. E a carga? As 1.512 unidades de vida congelada eram o prêmio, a razão pela qual a Marinha estava gastando recursos para rastrear um cargueiro de baixo custo. O navio militar que Jory mentalmente apelidou de Agulha desacelerou abruptamente. Não estava mais usando o boost gravitacional. Ele estava se aproximando do Argus, usando propulsores táticos. O movimento indicava que eles não queriam danificar o cargueiro. Eles queriam o conteúdo. Jory desligou o sistema de transferência de combustível. 40% era tudo o que ele teria. Ele não podia esperar mais. Ele precisava desengatar o Argus e fugir, mas a agulha já estava muito perto. O raio de varredura tática dela, se ativo, capturaria a assinatura de vida dele, denunciando-o como o único sobrevivente. Ele não tinha tempo para retornar à cabine principal e reativar os sistemas de camuflagem. A solução tinha que ser no local. Jory correu para a escotilha interna do módulo 7 Beta, o mesmo módulo que ele havia inspecionado repetidas vezes. O cheiro de ozônio e óleo sintético era um conforto familiar. Ele pegou uma chave de fenda de emergência e um pequeno maçarico de acetileno do cinto de ferramentas. Se ele não podia fugir, ele precisaria se esconder em plena vista. E o melhor lugar para se esconder no Argus era com a sua carga. O módulo 7 Beta era adjacente ao corredor principal que levava a Cryo Bay. Jory tirou os esquemas de emergência para o sistema de manutenção da Cryo Bay. Ele precisava desviar energia para isolar o setor dele, simulando uma falha de energia total. O scanner da agulha procuraria por fontes de calor, atividade cerebral e uso de energia. Se ele pudesse apagar sua assinatura, ele se tornaria temporariamente invisível. O conflito interno ardeu. Jory estava arriscando o sistema de manutenção dos colonos, mesmo que por um breve período. Se o isolamento durasse mais que 20 minutos, as cápsulas cryo perderiam o controle de temperatura. Ele não hesitou. 20 minutos ou todos morreremos agora. Jory abriu o painel de serviço mais próximo, revelando a teia de cabos coloridos. Ele não podia cortar os fios principais. O log registraria o sabotamento. Ele precisava criar um curto-circuito limpo e isolado. O roxum alto do Capitão Neres ainda ecoava. A voz do vocalista parecia gritar diretamente para Jory. Com a precisão cirúrgica de um homem que sabia que 1 milímetro de erro era o suficiente para matar, Jory usou o maçarico. A ponta azul do fogo lambeu o isolamento de 3 cabos interconectados, energia auxiliar, ventilação do corredor e sensor de presença. O cheiro de plástico queimado perfurou o ozônio. O painel de manutenção piscou e apagou. O corredor mergulhou em escuridão absoluta. Jory prendeu a respiração, o calor do maçarico ainda em suas narinas. Ele sabia que o campo gravitacional do Tychon Remnant estava ativamente distorcendo o tempo ao redor do Argus. Isso criava um efeito colateral útil: ruído eletromagnético maciço. O scanner da agulha teria dificuldade em varrer o interior de um navio com energia aparentemente morta em meio a todo aquele ruído. Jory moveu-se através da escuridão tátil, orientando-se pelo som fraco do hálito mecânico do navio. Ele podia ouvir o chiado distante dos freios magnéticos da agulha se acoplando na lateral do Argus. O som era alto, claro. Eles estavam a bordo. Jory se encolheu sob um conjunto de tubos de resfriamento do módulo. O chão tremeu levemente quando o time de invasão da agulha entrou no corredor. Eles não usavam passos silenciosos. O som de botas magnéticas, pesadas e despreocupadas, ecoou. Eles estavam confiantes. Um deles acendeu uma lanterna tática. O feixe varreu o chão, revelando as botas de Jory por um instante antes de se mover. Nenhuma leitura de vida. Uma voz distorcida pelo capacete ressoou. O cargueiro está vazio. Apenas o cheiro usual de radiação de baixo nível. Varredura completa da Cryobay. Prioridade 00. Manifestos e colonos. O fantasma não pode ter chegado longe. Jory apertou os olhos, sentindo a ponta fria do metal pressionada contra suas costelas. Ele era o fantasma. E agora? Ele não estava apenas lutando para entregar sua carga. Ele estava lutando contra a única civilização que poderia aceitá-lo. O scanner tático da marinha piscou contra a escuridão, varrendo o calor do casco. Jory rezou para que o pequeno curto-circuito que ele havia criado estivesse mascarando o calor residual do seu corpo. Um dos soldados parou a apenas 3 metros de distância, a respiração pesada e metálica ecoando na escuridão. O silêncio forçado de Jory o estava sufocando. Ele ouviu o ruído de um rifle sendo engatilhado. Há um desvio de energia secundário aqui, disse a segunda voz. Parece. Manutenção de rotina. Um defeito em um módulo de baixa prioridade, o 7 beta. Jory sentiu a mandíbula travar. Seu pedantismo havia retornado para assombrá-lo. Sua fixação em inspecionar o módulo 7 beta 3 vezes, seu histórico de verificação excessiva de redundâncias, havia deixado um rastro de papelada virtual para o time de invasão seguir. O fantasma não tinha chegado longe. O fantasma estava escondido no lugar mais previsível, o lugar que ele havia inspecionado antes de todo o universo se desfazer. A lanterna se virou e o feixe brilhou diretamente no rosto de Jory. Ele não piscou, ele estava cego pela luz, mas o cano do rifle estava apontado diretamente para o seu peito. A voz do soldado, agora mais próxima, sibilou no ar. O quê? Quem está aí? Jory forçou a mão a se mover, não para lutar, para agir. Sob a sua bota, no chão escuro, ele tateou o painel que havia isolado. Ele sabia exatamente onde a linha de energia para a Cryobuy passava. Ele tinha que restaurar a energia, expondo-se ao scanner, para iniciar o procedimento de fuga. Mas antes que Jory pudesse completar o circuito, o soldado recuou. Não, disse o soldado, sua voz cheia de cautela e confusão. Não há ninguém. É só o ruído de fundo da radiação do núcleo. Vamos. O capitão quer os manifestes. Jory ouviu os passos se afastarem na direção da Cryobuy. Ele havia sido salvo, não pelo seu plano, mas pela falha do scanner em meio ao ruído gravitacional extremo. Ele rastejou para fora do esconderijo, o corpo tremendo. O tempo estava acabando. O time de invasão estava a segundos de encontrar a carga. Jory correu em silêncio pela escuridão. Ele não podia ir para a ponte. Ele precisava de um plano que ninguém, nem mesmo um warrant mechanic, pudesse prever. Ele alcançou a porta de serviço do módulo 7 Beta. Puxou os esquemas da porta de cargueiro. Se ele não podia levar o navio, ele levaria o módulo. Ele inseriu o maçarico na trava manual, ignorando o cheiro de ozônio. Ele estava prestes a ejetar o módulo de carga 7 Beta no vácuo. Não como um ato de destruição, mas como isca. Seus dedos voaram pelos terminais. A agulha queria o Argus inteiro. Jory daria a eles uma parte, e enquanto eles estivessem ocupados com a parte, ele fugiria com o todo. A trava soltou um clique suave e mecânico. O módulo 7 Beta estava livre. Jory sentiu o chão tremer novamente, mas desta vez não era a agulha. Era a Cryobuy principal. O sistema de segurança que ele havia contornado, começando seu ciclo de autodefesa. O navio estava detectando a invasão. Jory olhou para o monitor. O tempo de resposta era de 4 minutos. 4 minutos antes que a Cryobuy selasse seus escudos de emergência e se tornasse impenetrável. E com ela, o núcleo de 1512 colonos. Ele não podia arriscar ejetar o módulo 7 Beta agora. Ele tinha que ir para a ponte. Ele tinha que mover o navio todo, ignorando a equipe de invasão na popa. Jory saiu do módulo 7 Beta e correu na direção do centro de controle auxiliar. Ele estava no corredor principal quando ouviu o som mais aterrorizante. Uma voz humana vinda do sistema de comunicação do Argus. Não um eco fantasma de 4 anos atrás. Era a voz de um dos invasores. Encontramos o manifest. Não há tripulação. Apenas o cargueiro e a carga. Estamos prontos para a extração. Mas a voz do capitão da agulha respondeu, calma e calculista, sem o menor traço de emoção. Negativo. Há uma anomalia de energia no setor principal. Se o fantasma ainda estiver vivo, ele estará lá. Não extraia a carga. Elimine o navio. Código. Purificação. Jory parou de correr, a respiração engatada na garganta. Eliminar o navio, com a carga ainda dentro. A agulha não estava interessada nos colonos. Estava interessada apenas em garantir que o fantasma de Jory não contaminasse o futuro. Os colonos eram apenas evidência a ser destruída. Ele não estava caçando um navio para roubar combustível. Ele estava fugindo de uma força militar disposta a cometer assassinato em massa para proteger a integridade de uma linha do tempo quebrada. Jory girou no calcanhar, voltando para o módulo 7 Beta. O plano mudou. Ele não faria uma isca. Ele faria um sacrifício. Ele ativou a alavanca de ejeção de emergência para o módulo 7 Beta. No momento em que o alarme de pressão disparou, ele saltou, mergulhando na escuridão do corredor enquanto a explosão controlada desprendia o módulo da lateral do Argus. A explosão foi violenta. Ele sentiu o impacto em seus dentes. O vácuo engoliu o cheiro de plástico queimado e ozônio. O Argus estava livre. e ele havia acabado de sacrificar o único módulo de armazenamento que continha as reservas extras de água e comida de emergência. Ele correu para a ponte, o som de botas magnéticas se apressando na direção contrária, alarmadas pela explosão. Jory chegou ao assento do capitão, ignorando o console que ainda continha o eco do riso de Neres. Ele assumiu o controle e ligou o drive de salto de emergência, sabendo que com a falta de combustível da Aurélia e sem as reservas do 7 Beta, ele teria apenas uma chance curta. Ele injetou a coordenada do beacon quântico, ignorando a marinha, o capitão Neres e a lógica. Divergência é obrigatória. O Argus saltou. Jory viu a agulha fora da janela, sua luz azul espectral desaparecendo no escuro profundo. Mas no painel de navegação, o resultado do salto o atingiu como um soco. Eles haviam se movido apenas 10 anos-luz, e o contador de recursos do Argus estava vermelho e piscando. Pior. O salto havia despertado algo no setor mais baixo. O sistema de monitoramento da Cryo Bay, antes um sussurro silencioso, agora tocava uma canção de ninar irritante. No monitor, um único alerta piscava em letras vermelhas gigantescas. Contagem regressiva para reativação manual. 00. 03. 59. Um dos 1512 colonos havia sido ejetado do ciclo de sono pela violência do salto. Jory não estava mais sozinho. E ele tinha exatos 3 minutos e 59 segundos antes de ter que olhar nos olhos da primeira pessoa que ele havia falhado em proteger, 4 anos tarde demais. The lullaby was the worst part. It wasn't a melody of comfort, but the synthesized, high-frequency whine of Cryo Unit 807 cycling through its forced restabilization protocols. A mechanical saccharine tune meant to soothe a waking colonist, now playing a terrifying countdown on Jory's bridge console. 03:40. He slammed the emergency manual override key, a heavy brass lever he had insisted on keeping operational despite the system's shift to pure digital control. The lever engaged with a solid, satisfying thunk. Override rejected. The main display flashed the error code in a sterile blue. Protocol Wake A09, unscheduled stasis breach detected, full system lock engaged. Manual restabilization required via physical interface in Cryobay B, sub-level 3. Jory cursed, a low, rasping sound in the empty bridge. His pedantry, the very thing that saved him from the temporal shear, was now actively working against him. The system viewed his forced jump maneuver as an unacceptable risk, locking down the most critical systems against potential rogue actions by the sole remaining crew member. He abandoned the bridge, sprinting, or rather controlled floating, down the central access shaft toward Cryobay B. The air grew immediately colder, the temperature dropping sharply the closer he got to the main containment area. The synth rock music of Captain Neris was now just a distant, distorted throb, the only heartbeat left in the Argus. 02:50. He reached the Cryo Bay access port. His lungs burned. He accessed the auxiliary power conduits for the door, deliberately using a low-level diagnostic port known only to elite mechanics. If he used the main access, the system would log him as bypassing safety, potentially triggering a final catastrophic lockdown of the stasis pods. The door hissed open, revealing the cavernous refrigerated silence of the cryodeck. Rows upon rows of sleek, polished stasis units stretched into the dimly lit distance. 1,512 lives, suspended in a time 4 years ahead of their fleet, and 2 minutes away from the end of their journey. The air here was pure, cold ozone, smelling like sterile metal and the promise of a distant future. Except for Unit 807, which glowed with an insistent, frantic orange light, emitting that damned high-pitched synthetic lullaby. Jory reached the unit, his breath clouding instantly. He checked the designation plate. Colonist, Kyle, M Unit 807. Scheduled re-entry, Cygnus Prime, T-Plot for 3 days. He pulled out his heavy multi-tool. Time for Plan B, the direct physical reboot. 2. Aero 5. He located the main diagnostic panel on the side of Unit 807 and went to work. His movements precise, practiced, yet frantic. He tried the hard reset sequence: cut power, purge coolant, re-inject stabilization fluid. The procedure should take 30 seconds max. He inserted the patch cable. The data transfer initiated and immediately spiked into the red. Data corruption. Cryo AI Core 3 requires primary handshake verification from bridge. Failure to verify. Protocol Wake A09 will execute in 01:45. Jory hit the panel with the heel of his palm. A sharp, stinging pain shot up his wrist. It was a failure of scale. He had successfully circumvented the ship's AI lock, but the individual cryo unit's sophisticated, redundant AI designed to protect the colonist from a potentially compromised bridge crew now refused to trust him. He was the ghost, and the machines of the future did not trust the ghosts of the past. He paused, forcing himself to breathe, tasting the metallic fear on his tongue. He had spent his career upholding the sanctity of safety protocols. Now, every layer of safety he had maintained was a lock on the cage holding him and his charge prisoner. "This is your fault, Silco. You checked everything too well." He glanced back at the main cryo bay tactical display. The proximity sensor, quiet since the jump, suddenly flickered. The needle was closing. The Marines had not been deterred by the jump. They had used the temporal residue he left behind, the microscopic ripple of the Argus dragging its timeline forward, as a navigational tether. They were now 40 light minutes away. 40 minutes until certain annihilation. 40% fuel. 40 minutes until they breach. One colonist waking up, Jory muttered, calculating the odds with frightening clarity. He was losing ground exponentially. He had to stabilize Unit 807 and jump simultaneously. He abandoned the physical reboot. Plan C. He needed a thermal bypass on the cooling lines of Unit 807. If he could flood the unit with emergency coolant, he could force the stasis cycle back down, overpowering the corrupted AI physically. But the emergency coolant reservoir required drawing power from the main drive capacitor, a charge Jory was desperately reserving for the single final jump he needed to make. He weighed the choice, the cold metal of the cryo unit pressing against his cheek. To save the one immediately waking colonist, Kyle M., by stabilizing him now, would draw down the jump capacitor enough to render his maximum jump distance useless. The Argus would be caught by the needle in minutes. To save the 511 required sacrificing the single life that was about to look him in the eye. He reached for the coolant bypass lever. 01:10. As his hand closed around the cold, slick metal, the Argus groaned. Not the usual mechanical sigh of a ship, but a structural protest. The main structural integrity readout on the cryobay auxiliary screen flashed briefly, an ugly amber warning. The jettison of Module 7 Beta, combined with the extreme G-forces of the uncontrolled jump, had created microfractures in the main drive core housing. The Argus was not just low on fuel, it was disintegrating. Warning: structural integrity degradation, remaining tolerance for high G maneuver. 1. Max jump capacity, 0. Jory stared at the screen. The reality sank in like a physical blow. He didn't have a final jump. He was trapped. The Argus was an anchor, and the Marines knew exactly where to find the temporal refugee. He had two choices: die here slowly, or die here fast while trying to save Kyle M. The only way out was to somehow fix the structural integrity before making the jump, a process that would take days, not minutes. 155. He tore his eyes from the structural readout and looked at Unit 807. He would try one last, Violent act of pedantry. He opened the smallest access panel on the unit's front plate, the maintenance port for the internal environment regulator. He inserted a custom-soldered circuit he always carried, a small analog device designed to bypass any digital lock on the cooling system. A tool of paranoia, now his last hope. He didn't activate the coolant purge. He activated the heating element of the bypass. The thought was insane, but precise. If the unit registered an immediate, catastrophic internal overheating, the AI might override Protocol A09 and dump emergency stabilization coolant automatically from the main ship reservoir, without drawing power from the drive capacitor. It was a massive gamble, risking thermal shock to the colonist to save the ship's energy. 140. Jory flipped the switch on the analog bypass. The orange glow of Unit 807 intensified to a violent red. A piercing shriek cutting through the synthetic lullaby echoed through the cryo bay. The other 511 units remained silent, stable. Jory waited, his body rigid, sweat beading on his forehead despite the frigid temperature. "Come on, Protocol Delta, dump the coolant, dump the damned coolant." But the unit AI was too corrupted. Instead of purging coolant, a small internal explosion, a failure of the thermal regulation cascade, blew the environment regulator panel off Unit 807, hitting the wall behind Jory with a sharp metallic clatter. The countdown timer on the main bay monitor switched from yellow numbers to solid, angry red. 125. The internal environment of Unit 807 was now compromised. The colonist would be waking up directly into extreme cold, disoriented and experiencing massive physical shock. "Damn it," Jory hissed, pulling the damaged analog tool away. A new sound joined the chaotic electronic symphony. A heavy, focused electromagnetic pulse originating from outside the Argus. The needle was testing its weapons, or more likely, attempting to disable the Argus's drive core remotely. The lights in Cryo Bay B dimmed again, flickering on the verge of total collapse. The drive core was fighting the pulse, but losing power rapidly. Jory felt the ship vibrate with the attack. He had no choice. He had to accept the death of Kyle M and jump immediately, praying the structural integrity could hold for 10 more light years. It was the only way to protect the 511. He spun toward the emergency comms panel, preparing to send a final desperate jump command to the flickering bridge. 105. The lullaby stopped. The mechanical silence was total. Only the harsh, ragged sound of Jory's own breathing filled the bay. The faceplate of Unit 807 hissed open. A cloud of frozen vapor escaped, quickly dissipating in the cold air. Jory froze, his hand inches from the comms panel. The countdown hit 0. A figure gaunt and pale from years of stasis moved slowly inside the unit. He was an older man, maybe 50, with sharp features and a look of deep, profound confusion. He tried to speak. His vocal cords, unused for years, made only a choked, wet noise. He blinked at the dim, strange lighting of the cryo bay. Then, his eyes focused. They fixed on Jory Silco, the warrant mechanic standing there, exhausted and trembling, illuminated by the red emergency lights. The colonist, Kyle M., looked directly at the man who had just failed to save him. Before Kyle could formulate a single, coherent word, the Argus main comms channel, the one Jory thought was secure, exploded with a cold, clear, authoritative voice. It was the commander of the Needle. They weren't using encrypted channels anymore. They were broadcasting. "Argus, this is Reconnaissance Unit Needle. We have confirmed the temporal anomaly. Stand down. Warrant Mechanic Jory Silco. Your location is compromised. Your temporal exile ends now." The voice was not distorted by static or 4 years of delay. It was immediate, present, and terrifyingly real. Jory realized that during the magnetic pulse, The Needle had managed to achieve a partial, non-temporal comms link. They didn't just know where he was, they knew who he was. Kyle, M., still struggling against the remnants of the stasis fluid, looked from Jory to the comms panel, horror dawning in his eyes. He finally managed a single guttural whisper. "Who?" Jory ignored the colonist, ignoring the immediate terror of the man he failed. He lunged back to the drive controls, slamming the primary ignition sequence with reckless disregard for the structural warnings. He injected the revised maximum range jump coordinates, knowing he was gambling the structural integrity of the Argus on a final throw of the dice. He was running from the present, chased by the future, and burdened by the waking ghost of his failure. The Argus responded with a violent metallic shriek of protest. Jory felt the deck shift beneath him as the ship lurched into the void, aiming for a destination the Needle could not follow at the cost of the structural integrity of the main core. Behind him, Kyle, M. screamed, not from the shock of waking but from the sudden violent force of the acceleration. The jump was successful, but the structural warning light on the dash immediately changed from amber to flashing crimson. The only sound left in the Argus was the rasping, painful breathing of warrant mechanic Jory Silco and the strangled cries of the first colonist who had been brutally awakened from his 4-year sleep. The Argus was breaking apart, the Marines were still chasing the signature, and now Jory had a witness to his command failures. A passenger who was awake, terrified, and already facing an impossible death. The scream Kyle, M. emitted was not a sound of pain, but a sound of profound structural failure. The raw, guttural noise was mirrored by the ship itself, a fresh metallic shriek of protest as the Argus settled into its damaged, new reality. Jory ignored the man, grabbing a medical injector from the wall kit. He slammed the sedative into Kyle's neck, administering a half-dose. Enough to stop the immediate hysterical panic and prevent cardiovascular collapse, but not enough to put him back under stasis. The colonist's eyes, fixed on Jory, glazed over, but his breathing remained harsh, ragged. He was conscious, paralyzed, a witness. The structural integrity warning light on the bridge console, now relocated hastily to the cryo bay's main diagnostic screen, pulsed a sickening crimson. The uncontrolled jump, combined with the initial shock of the jettisoned module, had stressed the Argus far beyond its tolerance. The drive core housing was compromised. Jory calculated the remaining tolerance, 1 minor maneuver, maybe 2. The next jump, even a short one, would tear the ship apart, killing the 1,512 lives instantly. Jory leaned against the cold metal of Unit 807, forcing himself to analyze the Needle's final partial data pulse. He needed to understand the true threat. The data was heavily encrypted, but the pulse had offered a temporary, low-level decryption key, likely a residual piece of the original fleet manifest. He worked quickly, his fingers dancing over the cold patch screen, bypassing the official colonist manifest filter. He went deeper into the administrative sub-data streams. The revelation was not a file, it was a flood. The 512 sleeping lives were not simply settlers bound for a new world. The standard manifest description was a lie. The classified designation appeared in stark, unblinking binary. Argus Project CYGNUS Archive. Designation Foundational Genetic Index, FGI. Jory felt the air leave his lungs. This wasn't a low-priority hauler. This was an ARC. He accessed the full document. The Tychon remnant collapse 4 years ago hadn't been an accident of navigation. It was a predicted, catastrophic gravitational shear that the Fleet Command had known about but underestimated. The entire Argus mission, and the fleet accompanying it, was a desperate, multi-stage distraction. The fleet was designed to draw the maximum attention, while the Argus, hidden by its low priority status and stationary anchor check, slipped through the temporal shear and carried the last remaining pure genetic blueprint of humanity to safety. Cygnus Prime was not a colony world. It was a deep space, hardened vault awaiting the arrival of the FGI. And Yori's petty pedantry, his unnecessary 3-time check of the empty module, had placed him exactly at the fulcrum of the shear, saving the archive and damning himself to solitary exile. The chilling, immediate consequence of this knowledge hit him like vacuum exposure. The Needle was not pursuing a temporal anomaly. They were pursuing the archive. They were not a military rescue unit from the future. They were an extraction, or worse, a containment team, tasked with securing the FGI at any cost, including destroying the ship and the lives inside, if necessary to prevent contamination or exposure. Jory looked at the face of Kale M., still immobile, eyes wide with unfocused terror. He was not just Kale M., a colonist. His sub-data profile identified him as Kale Marcus, FGI Bioarchivist, Key Personnel, Protocol Wake A09. Kyle was meant to be the first awake, the keeper of the biological keys. Jory hadn't just saved a life. He had awakened the sole expert needed to manage the archive's future. But Jory was the problem. His temporal displacement made him a contamination vector. The Needle wanted the cargo intact, but the Argus and its sole crew member had to be purged from the timeline. "The structural housing is degrading rapidly," Jory whispered, translating the crimson flicker on the screen into reality. He had, at best, 30 minutes before catastrophic failure, long before the Needle arrived. He needed structural reinforcement, days of repairs, not minutes. He needed heavy-duty plasteel struts, welding equipment, and thermal containment jackets. Resources he had jettisoned, stolen, or used up. He scanned the schematics of the cryobay. Everything was lightweight, minimal, designed for deep space transit, not battle damage repair. Except for the stasis pods themselves, each of the 512 units was encased in a tri-layered, high-density plasteel structural frame designed to withstand minor hull breaches and long-term gravitational stress. The frames, especially those of the redundant medical units, contained the precise material density needed to stabilize the main drive core housing. Jory was faced with the perfect, impossible dilemma. He could stabilize the drive core now by cannibalizing the archive itself. He could sacrifice 10 or 12 stasis units, 12 human lives, using their structural frames and power regulators to buy the Argus the structural integrity for one more, final, desperate jump. The 12 would die instantly in the mechanical dismantling, murdered by his own hand. Or he could respect the sanctity of those 12 lives, and in doing so, doom the entire Foundation genetic index, the 500 remaining lives, to catastrophic hull rupture within the hour. Sacrifice the few to save the species, or preserve integrity and lose everything. This was the horror of the steward's duty, distilled to its most acid-sharp point. Jory wasn't just a mechanic. He was the temporary guardian of humanity's future, forced to commit an act of unforgivable atrocity to preserve his charge. He looked at Kale M., whose face was a mask of doped paralysis. Jory didn't know if Kale had access to the full FGI mandate, but he knew the man understood the situation was dire. Kale could only watch. "I need 10 frames," Jory muttered, his voice raw. The number seemed small, yet vast. He called up the cryobay manifest overlay again, this time seeking the pods closest to the drive core access tunnel. They were units 132 to 141. 10 random lives, chosen by convenience of proximity. Wait. The trauma of the Pioneer incident years ago resurfaced, cold and clinical. Jory's first failure was due to distraction and lack of thoroughness. He could not afford random selection now. He accessed the full classified FGI profiles for the 10 units. He wasn't choosing based on location, he was choosing based on utility. The profiles flashed up. Unit 132, Dr. Helena Vash, specialist in viral resistance, genetic markers crucial for Cygnus viability. Unit 135, Engineer R. Sato, Cryo Maintenance Specialist. Unit 140, Master Sergeant A. Renfrew, Tactical Defense Protocol. Jory stared at the screen. The FGI was not a random cross-section of humanity. It was a curated collection of specialized knowledge. And his random selection had targeted critical personnel, the very individuals the Archive might need to activate Cygnus Prime. He had to choose the least critical, the most expendable in the Archive's overall matrix. But who decides which human life is expendable? You do, Warrant Mechanic. You are the only one left to decide. Jory's hands were shaking, not from cold, but from moral revulsion. He saw the face of Captain Neris, laughing at his pedantry, now replaced by the terrified, judgment-filled eyes of Kyle M. He chose the only way out, the least functional units. Unit 88 and 89, elderly colonist couple, their genetic profile marked as low priority due to age. Unit 457, marked with a redundant skill set, a historian, and 7 others designated similarly. He selected the 10 units. The screen displayed the confirmation prompt in aggressive red. Warning: decommissioning cryogenic unit is irreversible. Authorization code required. Jory's private access code, a string of digits he'd used for 20 years, suddenly felt like a chain of damning evidence. He entered the code. The system accepted the command. The cost was immediate and brutal. The 10 selected units, 500 pounds of specialized plasteel and human life, stopped emitting their low, reassuring hum. The lights went dead. Not a flicker, not a scream, just silence. The internal resources of the Argus shifted, prioritizing the remaining 502 lives. The power drain was immediately rerouted to the drive core access tunnel, preparing the power surge for the structural welding process. Kyle M., the paralyzed witness, forced a sound from his throat. It was not a question or a cry of fear. It was a single, wet, choking sob of sheer moral horror. He understood what Jory had just done. Jory grabbed the heavy-duty laser welder from the maintenance rack, the metal cool and heavy in his hand. He ignored Kyle, ignoring the 10 silent graves he had just created. He ran for the drive core access tunnel, the clock ticking faster than ever. He had 30 minutes to cut, weld, and reinforce the drive core housing before the needle arrived, and before the structural fractures brought the Argus down. He reached the access tunnel, secured the pressure seals, and activated the laser welder. The first cut into the plasteel frame of Unit 88 was loud, searing, and smelled intensely of burnt metal and ozone. As Jory worked, sweat mingling with the frigid air, the comms system sputtered back to life, receiving a low-priority, delayed data burst, the quantum beacon he had followed earlier. Jory paused the cutting, his breath catching. He had gambled on that beacon to save him once. The data burst contained only one element: highly compressed telemetry readings from the Argus's location. Jory analyzed the signature of the needle. The needle was not 40 minutes away. The temporal offset Jory had achieved with the reckless jump maneuver had decayed faster than he calculated due to the gravitational remnants of the Tychon shear. The needle, using an advanced interdiction system, had corrected its temporal path. The telemetry screamed the truth. The needle was 8 minutes away, moving at extreme velocity. Jory had sacrificed 10 lives to buy 30 minutes of repair time. He had 7 minutes left until hostile breach. He didn't have time to reinforce the core. He had committed murder for nothing. Jory slammed the welder onto the deck plate, the sound echoing dully in the confined space. He ran back toward the cryo bay, fueled by a terrifying new certainty. He couldn't fix the ship, but he could make the sacrifice matter. If the Needle wanted the archive, he would ensure they got the price he set. He reached the cryo bay, Kale's eyes following him, still wide and judging. Jory went directly to Kale's unit, grabbing the auxiliary power conduit. "You're the archivist, Kale," Jory grated out, his voice hoarse. "You know the protocol." Kale's eyes pleaded, but his body was still locked by the sedative. Jory bypassed the secondary locks on the main archive matrix. He was performing a system-wide breach, an act of intentional sabotage to the core FGI data. He didn't care about the logs. He didn't care about the future. He was committing his final, most devastating act of pedantry, ensuring that if he couldn't deliver the cargo, he would corrupt it beyond use by the enemy. He would make the sacrifice of the 10 count for the destruction of the whole. He initiated the file purge sequence for the FGI. But to complete a purge of that magnitude, he needed an immense, immediate power surge, a power surge that could only come from one place. Jory looked at the remaining 1502 units. He had chosen wrong before. Now, he would choose right. He slammed the power siphon controls, diverting the primary life support energy from the remaining 1502 cryo units into the core matrix purge. The lullaby was dead. The silence was absolute. Jory looked at the screen as the main FGI files began to delete, the data burning away in green, frantic light. He had seconds, but the power siphon worked both ways. The immense draw of power also initiated an automated counter-protocol he hadn't foreseen. The entire cryo bay sealed itself off with heavy blast doors, locking Jory out of the drive core tunnel, trapping him inside the chamber with the 1502 lives. The final safeguard against core damage was to isolate the cargo. Jory was locked in the archive, and Kyle, M.O., the archivist, watched him, his eyes clearing slightly as the sedative faded. "You doomed us," Kyle whispered, the paralysis lifting just enough for the words to form, clear and terrible. "Not the Needle. You." Jory looked at the main cryobay console. The FGI purge was at 30%, but a new indicator was flashing. The massive power spike had triggered the Argus' oldest, most primitive defense mechanism, a full emergency life support reboot cycle. The consequence, every single one of the remaining 1502 units was beginning the abrupt, violent wake-up protocol. Jory had sacrificed 10 to save the ship. He had corrupted the data to spite his pursuers. And in doing so, he had awakened the entire human archive, 40 light-years from their destination, with the Needle arriving in 7 minutes. He was no longer a lone steward. He was trapped with 1502 terrified witnesses to the total collapse of their future, orchestrated by the man who was supposed to save them. The temporal refugee had delivered his cargo directly into the fire. Before we proceed, log your entry. Which country or planet are you watching from right now? The commander is tracking every active signal. There are choices that cannot be undone. You can only live with the consequences. For warrant mechanic Jory Silco, the consequence of his desperate power siphon was the sound. It was not a collective roar, but a cascading rhythmic series of sighs, the release of stasis fluid and atmosphere from 1502 units, each hiss signifying a life wrenched into immediate, terrifying consciousness. The cryo bay, moments ago a chamber of silent, refrigerated hope, became an echoing tomb. Confused shouts rose first, thin and reedy from the prolonged stasis, followed by wet, hacking coughs as lungs struggled with the atmosphere change. Panic was not a wave, it was an avalanche, accelerating exponentially as each newly awakened colonist saw the red emergency lighting, the breached core access tunnel, and the silent, defunct units of the 10 people Jory had just murdered. Jory stood by Kyle, M. is pod, the blinking 40% complete FGI purge still illuminating his face in green, sickly light. He tried to reach the environmental controls, to inject sedation into the atmosphere, to tell them they were safe. All while the ship shuddered with the continuous punishing microfractures of the drive core housing. He couldn't access the ship-wide comms. The cryobay's internal AI, designed to protect the cargo from external tampering, had sealed him in and locked the controls. He was trapped with the consequences of his actions. Kyle, M., the archivist, struggled violently against the fading sedative. His eyes, now clear and accusatory, tracked Jory's every failed attempt to regain control. "The 10, Kyle rasped, his voice still weak but stealing with moral revulsion. "You killed them to save the structure, and now you're corrupting the data after they paid the price." "I tried to fix the drive," Jory countered, his voice sounding thin and desperate even to his own ears. "The needle is 8 minutes out. They are not here to save you. They are here to purge us." "Purge the contamination," Kyle corrected, his face pale with cold and terror. "And who is the contamination mechanic? The man who checks everything twice but destroys everything once he's allowed to act?" The accusation cut deeper than any laser scalpel. Jory felt the years of self-imposed guilt over the Pioneer collapse around him, confirming every suspicion he had of himself. He wasn't a hero driven by duty. He was a desperate man chasing personal redemption through pedantic thoroughness, and the moment that thoroughness failed, he resorted to calculated murder and sabotage. The noise in the cryobay swelled. Dozens of colonists were now free of their pods, moving like ghosts in the freezing air, their fear palpable and chaotic. A woman screamed near the aft section. A man began to weep hysterically, his cries echoing off the sterile metal walls. Jory needed a new plan, but his mind, stressed by 2 days of solitude and the immediate auditory assault of over 1,000 panicking people, refused to function. His hands began to shake uncontrollably, not just from the residual radiation, but from a profound internal collapse. He slumped against the console, letting the sheer weight of the moment crush him. He was the steward who had slaughtered 10 of his flock and awakened the rest into a furnace. He was the ghost who brought the fire. The FGI purge hit 50%. Then the floor trembled with a heavy magnetic thunk. The sound was decisive, final, and came from the drive core access tunnel, the reinforced blast doors that had sealed Jory in the cryobay. The needle was aboard. Jory knew the protocol. The Marines would have used shape charges to breach the outer hull, then magnetically fused their own containment unit to the Argus's main access point. They would be immune to the Argus's internal atmosphere and gravity fluctuations. They were the perfect predator. A clear, cold voice, devoid of static or emotion, cut through the panicked screams in the cryobay. It was Commander Thorne, broadcasting directly onto the Argus internal comms, specifically targeting the cryobay frequency. "Attention passengers of the Argus Archive. This is Commander Thorne, Reconnaissance Unit Needle. We are here to secure the FGI. Warrant Mechanic Jory Silko has been designated a temporal contamination agent and is under immediate interdiction. Do not resist." The sound of the colonists immediately quieted, replaced by an even more suffocating silence. They were staring at Jory. "The mechanic," Thorne continued, his voice calm, "has intentionally decommissioned 10 stasis units, units 88, 89, 457, and 7 others, using them for unauthorized structural reinforcement. He has also initiated a catastrophic data purge of the foundational genetic index. He has compromised your future and is now actively attempting to destroy the entire archive." Jory felt the blood drain from his face. Thorne hadn't just intercepted him. Thorne had full access to the ship's logs, exposing every terrible decision Jory had made. Thorne was turning Jory's intended cargo into his immediate judge and jury. A man, one of the first few who had fully revived, walked slowly toward Jory, his eyes filled with incredulous horror. 10 lives, the man whispered, the sound carrying easily in the sudden silence. You killed them. Jory tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He couldn't deny the accusation. Commander Thorne provided the answer for him. Confirmed, passenger. Warrant Mechanic Silco's personal authorization code was used to bypass the life support safeties. He chose survival over the sanctity of the FGI. His mission is irrelevant now. We are here to prevent further damage. The atmosphere in the cryo bay shifted from panic to focused, directed rage. Jory was surrounded by 1,500 terrified, betrayed faces. He was no longer a steward. He was a murderer locked in a cage with his victims. Thorne gave the final damning command. Team Delta, proceed with extraction protocol. Seal the drive core access with 3 thermal locks. Cryo bay, initiate protocol blackout. Purge atmosphere, depressurize, and prepare FGI units for transfer. Protocol blackout. Total power loss. Depressurization. The needle, intended to kill every awake colonist quickly to simplify the transfer of the remaining, still functional archive units. Kale, M., the archivist, let out a desperate, rattling cough, pointing a trembling finger at Jory. You were supposed to save us. You're just a coward hiding behind procedure. Jory slumped further, his head hitting the cold metal of the console. This was it. The total, utter defeat. He hadn't just failed the mission. He had failed his own moral compass, and every single person he was supposed to protect was now witness to his failure. He closed his eyes. Why was he still trying? For redemption? Kyle was right. It was only ego, always ego. He should have died with Neris 4 years ago. It would have been cleaner. He didn't want to live another moment knowing the man he was. The man who kills the few to save the many, only to fail the many anyway. Stop. Just stop, Silco. He felt a deep, profound weariness, the kind that settles in the bones and demands surrender. The fight was over. He had lost. Thorne's voice broke through Jory's haze, now closer, less formal, confirming the breach. Mechanic Silco. We are through the tertiary bulkhead. We are not interested in a firefight. Stand down, and the passengers will receive medical attention. Lies. Thorne was lying to keep Jory docile, but the lie gave Jory a precious few seconds. He forced his eyes open, staring at the console, watching the FGI purge tick to 65%. The ship groaned again, louder this time, a death rattle. Thorne was winning, completely. He had the archive, and Jory was contained. The Argus would rupture soon, solving the temporal contamination problem permanently. Jory looked away from the main console, seeking something, anything, that Thorne's team, focused on the breach and the FGI, might have missed. He scanned the auxiliary power schematics, looking not at the main power grid, which was dead, nor at the ghost battery he had just activated, which was nearly depleted. He searched for redundancies, the analog low-priority systems that even the Navy AI might overlook in a chaotic extraction scenario. He focused on the jettisoned Module 7 Beta. Jory had sacrificed the module's emergency reserves, but the physical connection itself, the umbilical that linked the module to the Argus, had not been fully severed by the emergency explosion. A low-level thermal regulator cable designed to monitor residual heat on the module during jettison was still physically attached to the Argus internal diagnostic port. It was an infinitesimal line, a forgotten thread of copper and data. But Jory knew, with the cold, precise certainty of a pedant, that the thermal regulator had its own independent microcapacitor, designed to send one final status report before freezing. It was too small to power the drive core, too small to transmit a full message. But maybe, just maybe, it was enough for one last, desperate act of sabotage. Jorn dragged his numb, shaking body toward the wall panel where the thermal regulator cable interface was located. He had seconds. The colony archivist, Kyle M., watched Yori move, confusion replacing the condemnation in his eyes. Yori reached the panel, his fingers fumbling with the tiny access hatch. He needed to physically bridge the thermal regulator's microcapacitor to the Argus primary comms output, bypassing the digital lock. It was pure, raw electrical shock intended to simulate an external electromagnetic pulse. He pulled his multi-tool, setting the tip to a precise, non-lethal current discharge. "Silco, what are you doing?" Kale shouted, the words echoing amongst the cries of the other colonists. Yori ignored him, focusing entirely on the task. His vision tunneled. Precision. Focus. Don't fail this. He plunged the tool into the interface ports. The microscopic current surged. Yori felt the jolt travel up his arm, burning away the paralysis temporarily. The main comms panel on the bridge flared violently, not with a message, but with a single massive untraceable power spike that flooded the adjacent needle comms link. Yori did not know what the spike would do to the needle's internal systems. He only knew it was the only thing he had left. He had thrown his final pathetic stone at the giant. The floor of the cryo bay erupted in noise. Not the sounds of colonists, but the sharp concussive blasts of magnetic rifles being discharged against the blast doors. The Marines were impatient. They were entering. Yori collapsed back against Kale's pod, his body convulsing from the electrical shock, watching the heavy metal doors buckle. Then, the cold, clear voice of Commander Thorne returned to the comms, but this time it was laced with alarm, a raw edge of genuine panic that Yori had never heard before. "Commander Thorne to all units, retreat immediately." That anomaly was not an EMP. It initiated the drive core overload. "The Argus is initiating self-destruct. Repeat, ship is destabilizing. Temporal containment failure imminent." Yori stared at the blast doors. Self-destruct? He had just initiated a high-magnitude localized power spike, not a drive core overload. It was impossible. But the screen screamed differently. The crimson light of the structural failure was replaced by an aggressive, oscillating green. Core overload sequence initiated. Time to containment failure, 2 minutes. Yori hadn't just broken the needle's comms. He had used the last, desperate ghost energy of a discarded module to trigger a catastrophic protocol he never knew existed. A final, primitive deadman switch designed to ensure that if the FGI was breached, it would take the entire ship, and anyone near it, into oblivion. He had 2 minutes. The Needle team was breaching the doors, and he was trapped in the archive, now a living bomb, with 1,500 terrified witnesses to his final, accidental failure. "Silco!" Kyle screamed, his voice fully returned, desperate and high-pitched. "What did you do?" Yori could only look at the buckling doors. He hadn't saved them. He hadn't corrupted the data. He had simply ignited the funeral pyre for himself, the archive, and the entire detachment of the future Marine Reconnaissance Unit. He had 2 minutes to find a way to stop the inevitable, and the doors were coming down. The oscillating green light of the core overload sequence was the most terrifying light Yori had ever witnessed. It was not the cold, rational red of danger, but the aggressive, unstable green of a system gone rogue, a promise of chaos within 2 minutes. Yori didn't waste the final seconds staring at the buckling blast doors. He wasn't thinking about fighting or fleeing. He was thinking about control. His last desperate act had triggered a protocol he didn't know existed, a deadman switch woven into the Argus's most obsolete systems, the kind of analog safety measure only an obsessive pedant would have kept meticulously maintained. The power spike hadn't just overwhelmed the Needle's comms, it had completed the FGI purge to 67%, then immediately redirected the massive energy back into the main capacitor, registering the breach and the data loss as the 2 primary conditions for total mission failure. The Argus, a ship designed only for bureaucracy and transit, was now an improvised gravitational bomb. Yori pushed off Kale's pod and launched himself toward the drive core access tunnel door, ignoring the screams of the recently awakened colonists. He needed to be physically at the console when the Marines breached. 1 minute, 40 seconds. He slammed his trembling hands onto the sealed door panel, accessing the maintenance override. The thick metal of the blast door, designed for radiation containment, now felt like a fragile membrane separating him from the cold efficiency of Commander Thorne's team. The heavy, magnetic boots of the Marines hit the deck with a metallic clang as the tertiary lock failed. The blast door didn't open. It tore inward, peeling back from the frame in a spray of incandescent sparks, the air pressure difference creating a brief, violent vacuum surge in the cryobay. 4 figures encased in heavy vacuum armor and carrying magnetic rifles entered. They moved with the terrifying practiced silence of predators, their helmets displaying no human features, only the targeting red of their sensor overlays. Commander Thorne, clearly the leader, stepped into the carnage, his stance wide, assessing the scene, the screaming colonists, the dead pods, the green oscillating light of impending core failure. "Hold fire!" Thorne's voice, amplified and chillingly calm, cut through the din. "Mechanic Silco, you have initiated a core overload sequence. Your act of contamination has escalated to an extinction event. You have 40 seconds to transfer command codes and surrender before we are forced to neutralize the entire section." Jory was already at the maintenance panel, ignoring Thorne, ignoring the rifle barrels pointing at his chest. He was working on the analog override for the core stabilizer rods, the old brass levers Neris used to mock him for polishing. "Protocol Delta 9, Jory shouted, his voice hoarse. "That protocol ensures the FGI cannot be taken intact. It's a final contingency, Thorne. You know the rules of the archive." Thorne took a slow, deliberate step forward, his rifle steady. "The archive rules are irrelevant. Your temporal anomaly is compromising the stability of this sector. We will take the remaining viable units. The contamination, meaning you and the awakened, will be purged to simplify the transition." 1 minute, 0 seconds. Yori pulled the first brass lever, forcing the drive core's primary magnetic containment field to drop to 50% capacity. The ship vibrated violently. Colonists screamed louder, falling to the deck. "If I transfer codes, you neutralize the containment," Jory yelled, his eyes glued to the flickering readout. "If I don't, the Argus detonates, collapsing the gravity well and creating a temporal ripple that scrambles your entire future." This was Jory's only leverage, the threat of absolute mutual destruction. Thorne's mission was temporal containment and securing the FGI. Jory was offering him a choice between 2 failures, one manageable, Jory's death, one catastrophic, temporal chaos. Thorne hesitated. Jory saw the infinitesimal delay in the movement of his helmet, the moment of calculation. "You are bluffing, Silco. A warrant mechanic does not possess the knowledge to control a core overload." "Maybe not," Jory gasped, pulling the second analog lever. He felt a sharp, electrical pain shoot through his hand, a physical cost for the action. "But the Argus does. And I spent 20 years checking her redundant systems twice. This ship has a mind of its own, Thorne, and it just decided you can't have its cargo." The green light intensified, cycling faster. The temperature in the cryobay spiked violently, then dropped, fluctuating wildly as the core destabilized. Thorne realized the reality. Jory wasn't the threat. The ship was. And Jory, the pedant, was the only one who knew the ship's deepest, most irrational instincts. "Team Beta, secure the mechanic," Thorne commanded, his voice tight. "Non-lethal restraint. Do not damage the remaining FGI units." 2 Marines broke rank, moving toward Jory. They were focused on restraint, not fire. confirming Jory's control over the situation. They needed him alive long enough to stop the overload. Jory didn't move to fight them. He reached for the third analog lever, the most dangerous one. The manual override for the emergency fuel dump. Kyle, M.E., the archivist, who had been watching in paralyzed horror, found his voice again, now laced with moral dread. "Silco, stop. If you dump the fuel now, we won't have enough to reach anywhere. You'll be condemning us to slow death in the void." Jory paused, his fingers resting on the cold brass. He looked directly at Kyle. The eyes of the paralyzed witness were the mirror of his own guilt. "We have 30 seconds, Kyle," Jory stated, his voice devoid of emotion. "If I don't dump the fuel, the core detonates and kills us all instantly. If I do, we die slow, but we survive. This." He was choosing the slow, horrifying death in the void over the immediate clean destruction by Thorn. It was not a heroic choice. It was a pragmatic acceptance of the worst possible outcome. "You choose murder again," Kyle screamed. "I choose control," Jory grated, and slammed the final lever. The Argus shuddered as the emergency fuel began to vent into the void. The green light on the console turned a terrifying, pulsing yellow. The core overload sequence had been interrupted, not stopped. The detonation was delayed, redirected. The Argus would rupture, but slowly, like a slow-motion car crash that could take days to reach critical mass. The Marines, startled by the fuel dump and the violent vibration, hesitated. Thorn saw his window closing. "Silco, you have secured mutual destruction. We cannot allow this temporal anomaly to scatter into the jump lanes. You must surrender and allow us to contain the vessel." "The vessel is gone, Thorn," Jory countered, finally turning to face the commander. "The Argus died 4 years ago with the fleet. You are boarding a ghost, and ghosts don't surrender." Jory looked at the main cryobay console. The data purge was at 81%. He had enough energy from the remaining fuel to complete the purge, but not to save himself. He grabbed a heavy maintenance torch from the wall, not to fight, but to destroy the console. He was denying Thorn the remaining FGI data, even if it meant confirming his status as the Archive's executioner. Thorn anticipated the move. "Don't touch that console. If you destroy the remaining data, the FGI is irrevocably corrupted." Jory raised the torch. "That was the goal, Commander. If I can't deliver the future, no one can steal it." He ignited the torch. The blinding white light seared the cold air, filling the breach with the stench of ozone and scorched metal. Before Jory could bring the torch down, Thorn fired, not at Jory, but at the torch itself. The magnetic blast hit the heavy tool, knocking it from Jory's grasp with a deafening clang. The Marine surged forward, tackling Jory, pinning his exhausted, trembling body to the deck. He offered no resistance. His strength was gone. Thorn stood over him, the cold muzzle of his rifle pressed against Jory's thin skin. "Your persistence is admirable, mechanic, but ultimately irrelevant. We have containment. The ship is dying, but the Archive is secured." But as Thorn spoke, the main cryobay console, the one Jory had been fighting over, flashed a new massive error code. "FGI purge complete, 100%. Data integrity, 0. Thorn froze. "Impossible. We stabilized the power draw." "You stabilized the main power," Jory whispered, tasting blood and synth coffee. "But the purge was drawing energy from the 10 dead units. My sacrifice. You missed the local feedback loop. The dead completed the task." Thorn looked at the 10 defunct pods, the silent testimony to Jory's impossible choice. The irony was devastating. Jory's failure, the unauthorized execution of 10 colonists, had ultimately become the engine of his tactical victory. He had committed murder to purge the data. "You destroyed humanity's last hope," Thorn stated, his voice low, heavy with intellectual defeat. "I gave humanity its freedom," Jory retorted, pushing the words through his bruised throat. Your project wasn't an archive, Thorn. It was a prison. Now the data is gone, and the cargo, the people, are awake. You can't put 1,500 witnesses back in stasis. Thorn looked at the chaos, the colonists, terrified but now actively running toward the breach, their survival instincts overriding their terror. They were contaminated, awake, and in the hands of Jory Silco, the temporal refugee. Thorn made the final, crucial calculation. Securing the FGI data was impossible. Capturing Jory Silco was a minor objective compared to the temporal risk. He couldn't risk the entire unit in a slow, toxic fight against a ship that was actively tearing itself apart. Team Delta, abort extraction. Priority: containment of temporal ripple. Disengage all magnetic tethers. We are leaving the sector. Thorn looked down at Jory, who was being held down by 2 Marines. You win the battle, mechanic, but the Argus is still a decaying singularity. You are now responsible for 1,502 lives on a decaying ship, 80 light years from help, with no coordinates and no archive data to guide them. Thorn nodded once to his team. Jory was released abruptly onto the freezing deck. The Marines retreated instantly, pulling the shattered blast door partially closed behind them, their movements swift and final. The magnetic shriek of the needle disengaging was deafening. Jory heard the faint, distant whine of its drive, firing as the enemy retreated, accepting a massive, costly but survivable defeat. Jory lay there, breathing heavily, the pain in his body irrelevant compared to the sudden hollow silence of victory. He had driven off the threat, but at an astronomical cost. He rolled over, dragging himself up by Kyle's pod. He looked out the main viewport. The needle was gone. He was alive. The 1,502 remaining colonists were awake, terrified, but safe from Thorn. The data was purged. The future was denied to the control of the temporal military. But the cost was immediate and palpable. The console screamed yellow. The fuel gauge read 0. The structural integrity monitor was a frantic mess of red and amber lines. The Argus was an unstable wreck, drifting, rupturing, and filled with over 1,500 bewildered people whose collective knowledge, the only thing that could have saved them, Jory had just eradicated. Jory looked at Kyle M., who was now sitting up, fully conscious, staring at the ruins of his mission. You had the chance to deliver the cargo whole, Kyle whispered, the accusation now mixed with a terrible, clear understanding of their fate. But you chose to destroy the data and save us from them. You didn't save us, Silco. You made us permanently, hopelessly, alone. Jory looked down at his hands, the hands that had checked the cargo module 3 times. The hands that pulled the levers of destruction and salvation. They were shaking uncontrollably, permanently. He was a mechanic who had permanently damaged his ability to fix anything delicate ever again. He closed his eyes, accepting the permanent, bitter truth. He was not a hero. He was simply a pedant who, when forced to choose, always chose to break the rules in the most precise, costly way possible. He was still the steward. But his stewardship had begun with murder and ended in absolute solitude, trapped with the very people he had failed and facing the slow, inevitable death in the hostile void. He had won a moment, but he had lost their future. The Argus drifted, silent except for the harsh, ragged breathing of the survivors, waiting for the 7 days of slow structural collapse Jory knew was coming. 7 days to make the final, impossible choice. The days that followed were not a countdown, but a collapse. Jory Silco, covered in soot, dried blood, and the pervasive cold sweat of exhaustion, moved through the Argus like a curator through a looted museum. His victory over the needle was Pyrrhic. He had won a moment, but condemned himself and the 1,502 colonists to a slow, drawn-out suffocation in the void. The structural decay was accelerating. The fuel dump had prevented immediate detonation, but the core was compromised. Jory calculated the maximum stable period. 3 days. Beyond that, the hull microfractures would compound, and the Argus would breach containment, killing everyone instantly. The awakened colonists were hysterical refugees. Jory, guided by Kale M., whose moral revulsion had solidified into cold, functional pragmatism, organized the terrified masses. Kale M. was the only one who understood the biological imperative of the FGI, even if the data was gone. He knew how to ration the atmospheric scrubbers and how to conserve the dwindling emergency water reserves. Jory had murdered 10 lives, but Kale's gaze, fixed on the ship's inevitable end, forced Jory to work, not for redemption, but for delayed failure. The confrontation with the emerging colonist council was brutal. They demanded solutions, a final jump, rescue signals. "We have no fuel," Jory repeated, his voice raw. His hands, perpetually trembling from the electric shock and fatigue, made him look like a man whose mechanical soul had been short-circuited. "The data, the FGI, is gone. We cannot navigate 80 light-years. The ship is designed to die in 3 days." "Then fix it, warrant mechanic." A woman, a metallurgist from the archive, shouted, her face streaked with tears and cold. Jory pointed a shaking finger at the structural monitor, still screaming yellow and red. "I fixed it enough to survive the Navy. To fix it permanently requires days of welding and material we jettisoned with Module 7 Beta. I bought you 3 days of air at the cost of 10 lives to ensure no one could steal your future. That is the end of my mechanical capability." The metallurgist, unable to deny the precision of his terminal diagnosis, broke down sobbing. Jory learned a terrible, mature truth in those 3 days. Control is merely the capacity to choose the manner of your demise. He had chosen slow suffocation over clean explosion. He had chosen stewardship over self-preservation, knowing that the greatest failure of his life, the pedantry that saved him, was now utterly useless. The problem was not mechanical, it was human. On the 3rd day, the structural integrity monitor flatlined. The Argus had entered terminal failure. Kyle M. found Jory in the main cryo bay, now stripped bare of all unnecessary panels and equipment. Jory was welding the remaining 10 redundant structural plates he had saved from the deceased units onto the hull, using the last dregs of power from the emergency battery. He was not reinforcing the ship. He was creating internal bulkheads, sealing the archive section off from the rest of the ship. "What are you doing, Silco?" Kyle asked, his voice flat. "I can't fix the ship," Jory grunted, the welder light blinding in the low atmosphere. "But I can contain the contamination. The Argus is a decaying singularity. It will tear itself apart and create a temporal ripple that the needle can track forever. I won't deliver them to Cygnus Prime, but I can deliver them from Thorn." Jory explained his final protocol. The Argus would be reduced to its core, a hardened sarcophagus. He would bypass the drive core entirely and use the remaining battery power, calculated to the exact millijoule, to initiate a final, complete magnetic containment field around the central cryobay section. This would prevent temporal signature bleed, effectively rendering the archive invisible, permanently stationary, and safe from external pursuit. But the field would require all remaining energy. Every atmospheric scrubber, every light, every heater, everything would cease. The 502 lives would be frozen in absolute dark and cold, trapped in a stasis more profound than cryo, without support or hope of awakening, merely preserved indefinitely in the hostile void. A permanent, living tomb. "You are murdering them all anyway," Kale stated without passion. "No," Jory said, shutting down the welder. He removed his helmet. His face was parchment thin, his eyes wide and vacant. "I am delivering them to the end of the line, the end of the chase. This is the only habitable rock left for them. A perfect, dark silence, preserved by my failure. Kyle looked at the assembled colonists, now huddled in the center of the cryobay, too exhausted to scream, watching Jory with resigned horror. "What about you?" Kyle asked. Jory pointed to the emergency airlock next to his control panel. "The magnetic containment field cannot sustain a human signature inside. I am the contamination. I will stabilize the field, initiate the final sequence, and manually purge myself through the airlock. I will drift alone, a kilometer away. If anyone ever finds the Argus, they will find the archive intact, stable, and untainted by the temporal anomaly. They will not find the steward." He had calculated his final act with the exactness of a man checking a decimal point 3 times. The purge was necessary, precise, and absolute. Jory walked to the central console. The remaining colonists watched him, silent, accepting their fate at the hands of the man who had done the impossible. He saved them from the future, only to condemn them to absolute present solitude. He activated the final, irreversible containment sequence. The remaining lights in the cryobay began to dim, sucking the heat and energy from the room. The cold was instantaneous, biting, the final curtain call. The time dilation was not a phenomenon, Jory whispered to himself, looking at the dead consoles. It was a wall, and walls, I discovered, are only defined by what we choose to put on the other side. He had chosen solitude. Jory stepped into the emergency airlock, the small chamber sealing with a heavy thunk. He placed his palm on the manual depressurization button. He was doing this alone, exactly as he began. No witnesses, no applause, no redemption, just protocol. He activated the internal purge. The last of the recycled air rushed out into the void, pulling the residual warmth and smell of the ship away from him. He was floating in the dark, 35 years old, looking like 50. His mission complete, his duty fulfilled in the most horrific way possible. He had delivered the cargo, not to a new civilization, but to perpetual preservation, beyond time, beyond war, beyond saving. He looked out the small airlock window at the massive, darkening hull of the Argus. It was still silent, a perfect, dark monument of failure and precise control. Warrant mechanic Jory Silko hit the final external ejection button. He was launched away from the Argus, drifting toward the impenetrable empty blackness. The hiss of the pressure seal, the smell of ozone and synthetic oil, had finally stopped, leaving only the silence of the complete, final delivery. This story is now part of the archive. Subscribe to help preserve future transmissions and share this episode with someone who still believes in science fiction.